Now, earlier this week, as you know, a ceasefire was agreed between Israel and the militant Palestinian group Hamas after a recent flare-up in violence left at least 240 people dead. That ceasefire has held for 2 days now. Beneath this latest violence is, of course, the bigger conflict, which is one of the most complicated and internationally politically divisive in the world. There's disputes over whose land is whose, disputes over which refugees are allowed to return where. Then there's religious disputes over the role of Jerusalem. And you have some people on each side who think the other really shouldn't exist at all. Yesterday, a protest was held in Swindon in what organisers say was a show of support to the Palestinian people. Earlier, we heard from Fadoa Govertz, part of the group calling itself Swindon Palestine Solidarity.
The main thing we wanted to do was to raise awareness of the Palestinian cause. People had heard of the demonstrations in London, Oxford and Bristol. And here in Swindon, we just wanted to raise the awareness and join other people around our nation to show solidarity with Palestine.
It is a terrible situation, whichever side you are on. But the Israeli military has repeatedly said what it's been doing is defending itself against Hamas, the militant group responsible for firing rockets into Israel. So do you not think that Hamas is part of the reason for the Palestinian people being treated unfairly?
To be honest, I don't believe Hamas or any other political group in Palestine should take the blame for anything. We should say it as it is, and United Nations and under international law, this is illegal occupation of Palestinian lands, and what happened in the Gaza Strip is absolutely inhumane under any circumstances. Hamas is a political group which the people in Gaza have voted for, whether we like it or not. They are democratically elected, and we as people outside of Gaza, it's very hard to say what we think they should be voting for. What they are voting for is resistance against being driven out of their own homes and out of our own land and being under siege and under blockade for years now by the Israeli government and the Egyptian government.
That's Fadoa Govertz there, part of the group calling itself Swindon Palestine Solidarity, on why they marched in Swindon yesterday. Also based here in Wiltshire is the organisation called Christians United for Israel. Alastair Kirk is from that group. Alastair, what does your organisation stand for? If I could just start with that point first. Christians United for Israel, who are you?
Oh, good morning, Sue. Yes, so Christians United for Israel, we represent thousands of Christians who believe it is the right thing to stand with the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. So I, like so many Christians throughout the country and millions around the world, after reading the Bible, recognize that we have a deep connection with Israel and the Jewish people. And when we understand the roots of our Christian faith, we develop a real affinity with the Jewish people and realize that we need to stand with Jews against anti-Semitism, wherever it exists, whether it's here in the UK or directed at Israel. And that's why the terrible rise of anti-Semitism in the country over the past few days, past week, I think I saw figures of over 400% rise in the past week, is a real concern and is unacceptable.
But do you recognise the point that Fadoa was making there about how the Palestinian people as a whole are being treated, or as she put it, mistreated for many, many years? Do you recognise that?
Well, Sue, I was deeply concerned about what I just heard. I did hear it earlier. And she said Hamas and other terror groups should not take the blame for anything. I couldn't quite believe what I was hearing. She also said that it was a political group, democratically elected. This isn't a democratic group. Hamas is an internationally prescribed terrorist organization, and its aims is to wipe Israel off the map and to also kill Jews. It states that in its charter, and it mentions Jews specifically. And I think sometimes we have this idea that Hamas is some sort of militant fringe group, something which is on the extremist fringes of society. But in fact, it controls all aspects of the Gaza Strip. It controls healthcare, schools, welfare. They receive millions of pounds of British taxpayers' money, only to turn it into rockets aimed at Israel, instead of meeting the humanitarian needs of the Palestinian people. So to answer your question, I believe the Palestinian people deserve better than that. The Israeli people deserve better than that. And if people want what is best for the Palestinian people, and we all should want what is best for them, you have to condemn Hamas. You have to condemn Hamas instead of excusing and justifying them and blaming Israel, which seems to be the narrative, sadly.
I can hear the passion in your voice, Alastair, just as I heard the passion in Fadoa's voice earlier. There is no solution for this dispute, this centuries-old dispute, is there?
Well, as a Christian, and remember the Bible says that we're to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. So I'm sure we all want peace in that part of the world. But we've been very concerned by what we've seen over the past week, and some of this does not sadly always come through in the media reports. Look, over the past 11 days, or the 11 days during the recent fighting, Hamas fired over 4,000 rockets indiscriminately at civilian areas in southern and central Israel. Now, thankfully, Israel has what's called the Iron Dome anti-missile system. So they actually intercepted 90% of those rockets. Otherwise, the figures of Israeli casualties would have been a lot larger. And look, Israel is a sovereign, democratic state, and it has a duty to defend itself against attacks. Now, can you imagine if this was happening to us here in the UK, if we were being bombarded with rockets from across our borders? We would have that right to defend ourselves. And in contrast, Israel is only targeting terror sites in Gaza. And it does its best. It's difficult to avoid civilian casualties, but they do their best. And, whereas Israel is trying to avoid casualties on both sides, Hamas doesn't care for civilians. Palestinian lives or Israeli lives. Hamas is actually committing a double war crime, and it needs to be called out. It's deliberately attacking civilians in Israel, Jews and Arabs in Israel, because there are about 20% Arab of Israeli population is Arab. It's deliberately attacking Israel, civilians in Israel, and it's deliberately placing its rocket launchers in dense civilian areas in Hamas. And it's quite interesting that around 12 to 15% of rockets fired at Israel by Hamas don't even reach Israel. They land in Gaza. And this is verified information. And so, yes, the Palestinian people are suffering, but they are suffering upon the grip of Hamas. And, of course, everyone wants peace. Everyone wants peace. But that peace has to be, the foundation has to be peace. And it's very, very hard for Israel to deal with a terror group that wishes to annihilate it.
Alastair, thank you for joining us this morning. Alastair Kirk from the organisation called Christians United for Israel, speaking about the conflict in Gaza, where a ceasefire has held now for 2 days.